Woo! Okay. So, Gayatri, Dr. Sethi, you're home. The floor is yours.
Dr. Rodriguez, it's an absolute honor to be present and to share virtual space across borders with you. I'm speaking to you from the sacred lands of the Muskogee. I am a guest here on these lands, and I too am remembering the 215 children in a long story of settler colonial genocide that continues to this day. And I want to pause a moment to really allow the seeds that you planted at the beginning to take root in the intentions for how we proceed. And it is in the spirit of radical hope and courage that I offer my gratitude for being here today. So I have some prepared remarks, and I wanted to ground them a little bit in some of the readings that you have done for today, but I also wanted to share a little bit more about my life, because one of the ways that we decolonize learning, one of the ways that we do popular education, is that we take what we have as knowledge and the rich resources of knowledge that you mentioned from my bio, and we make them accessible. One of the lessons that I have learned in the last 4 years, and I continue to learn every day, is that a lot of elitism gets taught to us in the name of education. And because I went to elitist institutions of learning and I thought I was going to be an educator, I think along the way in those journeys and these very institutions of oppression, I picked up a lot of elitism. And so part of my own journey has been to unlearn some of that and to realize that I have a sacred responsibility to take all of this education and learning that I have acquired and to make it accessible and to debunk the myths of expertise and debunk these myths of hoarding of intellectual resources. And so one of the ways I do that is that I created this online platform on Instagram. So I have a number of Bookstagram folks who, you might follow even when you're looking for reading recommendations. And I took that platform, and for the last 2 years, I am the Desi book auntie. Now you wouldn't expect somebody, and I no longer use my title of Dr. Sethi. And so people expect Bookstagrammer, and yet I offer these book recommendations as if I were preparing a syllabus or a lesson plan. So today I kind of approached it that way, and I said, okay, so if I were going to build a stack in remembrance of these children, what would I do if I were a teacher and educator? Because children's literature is one of the areas that I study and continue to study. And so what I did was I selected this book that I'd like to share with you, because I know some of you are early childhood educators. And I said, okay, so how would I tell a 5-year-old about this very traumatizing news that we're getting from Ottawa? And, this isn't new news. And so how would I explain this to a 5-year-old? Or if I were a teacher in a classroom with 5-year-olds, what would I read to them? And I would actually read to them We Are Still Here by Tracy Sorrell. And if you're not familiar with this picture book, it is empowering. It gives us the story of children and the history of assimilation. So it gives you a little bit of a lesson on assimilation and what that was. And because I can't simultaneously show you the picture and read, I'm just going to read you the segment on this page that says, assimilation. Most US leaders did not respect our ways and thought it would be better for us to adopt their beliefs and practices. From the country's earliest days, white men sought to weaken our Native nations' power to govern, destroy Native nations' power to govern, destroy Native families by taking our children away and sending many to boarding schools, outlaw our sacred practices, and punish us for speaking our own languages. And it's here in a book, but the next page is the page I want to show you. So it's a page of children in the classroom, if you can see that. See that? And it says, even under these harsh laws, Native nations say, we are still here. And so on every page, it tells you the history of trauma and genocide and settler colonialism in a really factual way. And then it says, in spite of all of this, Native nations say, we are still here. Noting these new laws, Native nations say, we are still here. And so I chose this book to begin today. And, you know, this is how I take things that are happening in the day-to-day, and I try to find resources that teachers or educators or librarians could use for creating lessons. And this is one of the ways that I currently work instead of teaching in a college classroom, as I used to for a while. And then I built a stack for older children, built on that, and this is the book called Ancestor Approved. And it is a story book that tells you about, and it's written by First Nations authors, and each is a story. There are at least, I believe, 20 of them in here, and there are poems as well. And it is a beautiful affirmation again of Native life. So I said something on my social media last week, maybe it was, Clelia, Dr. Rodriguez, that I said, you know, we're also living in a time when we're not supposed to, in the US, teach critical race theory. Well, you know, those of us who teach from this framework of decolonizing education, that's what we do. I mean, everything is grounded in that work. And so how can we not teach that? And so I said, well, the way that I would do it, then I would be teaching Black joy. I would be teaching Black resilience. And there are ways to do that. So that was the little tidbit I wanted to share with you about the children's literature and the book curating work that I do, because Dr. Rodriguez, you know, requested me to share about that. And I'll pause here to see if you wanted to direct me in a particular direction from this point.
You can call me Clelia Gayatri.
Okay. I also don't use my title, so.
No, it's okay. No, because yeah, we're home here. We're home. What was I gonna say? Well, I think that maybe one of the things that I'm really excited for you to share is about, or maybe you can give us information later on about how DESI became to be and what it is and the work that you're doing there. Because I think a lot of people now that we're sort of like towards the end of the course, I think it would be great to see exemplify the kind of initiatives or the continuation of work to kind of like give people some form of ideas. You can address that after, but I just wanted to make sure that that is covered.
Absolutely, I'll make sure of that. Mm-hmm. And I can do that right now since we're talking about the Kidlit component, and I want to go about talking a little bit more specifically about bell hooks and feminist learning. And so one of the things I realized when I stopped teaching formally in the college classroom, and I did used to teach courses in children's literature, and what my interest was always, how can I find those? So did you know that these two books I shared with you are less than 1% of all books published? Okay, so if I go out looking for books written by First Nations authors, they are less than 1% of all books published. So in a similar vein, South Asian books, and I use the term Desi to be diasporic, because there are South Asian diaspora folks all over the African continents, as I grew up, all over Eurasia, all over the Indian subcontinent, as well as all through the Caribbean. So, you know, from as far away as Fiji to Guyana, we have Desi folks. And so I use that term that way. And I wanted to find authors who were writing for children. And I really had a hard time because, again, they are a very small percentage of all the books published any given year. And so this field of publishing, especially children's literature, is still very much assuming that the potential reader is a white child and that the potential author is going to write to that gaze. And so I began this path about 3 years ago to cultivate relationships, because one of the things that we already know, since you all have been sharing space and learning from Clelia, you know that cultivating relationships is one of the ways that we do education in this way, right? So I began to cultivate relationships with a variety of authors, because once again, in the West, in Canada, in the US, when you find South Asian descent authors, many of them are first generation, and many of them are still very much within the majority, within the minority, if that makes sense. So, and I'm going to make the link between this and what Bell Hooks says. So within a community, so let's say we call it the South Asian Americans. Well, most of the voices that you could find, most of the authors that I could find, were still using certain tropes. And we're kind of in this dominant discourse about the South Asian culture. And so I started to then cultivate relationships with folks from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and folks who weren't necessarily in these stories. And that is how the Desi Kidlit community came about. There is an author whose books you may be familiar with, Sadia Faruqi, and she's originally from Pakistan, and she writes the series of for young readers called the Yasmin books. And she is pretty much an expert in writing middle grade books. And one of her more recent books is called 1,000 Questions. And it's about a child who has 1,000 questions when she first visits Pakistan. And so she and I got together and we decided that because of all of these dynamics, that someone with my complex Desi identities and someone with her complex Desi identities would collaborate and create this community and cultivate it. So we have a group of, as of today, 99 Kidlit writers and illustrators who self-identify as Desi, who support each other on an ongoing basis. And we've had 2 summits where we get together, and it's a no-cost opportunity to learn with each other and from each other, which didn't exist because, again, in the Kidlit community, we are so much the margins. And also we, how do I explain it? We don't have the space to be able to talk to each other about how we can be expansive about our own stories. So this Desi Kidlit community, what we're doing is we're getting braver. And in fact, given today's seed of hope, our summit that we had in March was basically about radical hope. So every message that we got, every panel that we did, every book that we showcased was all about hope. And we called it hopeful audacity. So your 2 seeds go together. And so that's why we vibe. And I was just delighted that you came and you attended as our guest, because we were being courageous and we were being hopeful by creating space for us to write and tell these stories that are as yet untold. So that community exists, and there is, at some point, maybe in the chat, you could put in the website. It's the desikidlitcommunity.weebly.com. And maybe Jamila, who's here, who is my beloved and who is a co-learner of mine. She's one of my gurus and took Kidlit courses with me as her professor many years ago and continues to share learning space with me. And so Jamila might pop that in the chat for us. So that is what happened, was that it was a very organic, kind of like your Seeds of Change, organic, community driven from a audacious hope that we can do something and create something in the world. And that the way to do it would be to leverage our resources and knowledge rather than hoarding that, right? Because if you hoard your seeds, they don't sprout. I'm not much of a gardener, but that's one thing I do know. And so that's what we're doing in that community, is we're taking ideas and we're really offering each other a space encouragement, which we all needed, because otherwise, you know, publishing or academia or wherever, whichever space we inhabit, we tend to get the messages that we have to have individual success. And that's really not how I see us progressing into the future. And so that's how that community came about. And again, it's all volunteer-based. Nobody gets paid a thing. All of the work I do in sharing about the books is all a labor of community care. And that, I think, is also kind of one of the ways that we can decolonize education, is to be able to take the paid component out of the teaching and community care component, to like delink the two. And so that's what I'm trying to do. It's very difficult to unlearn, but I'm trying. So that's the basic kidlit part of my life. And then the other part of my life is that I have a number of people who now call me auntie, but used to call me professor. And when I left the academic space and formal teaching, they wouldn't let go of me. And so we have collaborated and stayed together as a community. And we call ourselves Alt College. And we create spaces of learning together. We, you know, when we didn't have this current life, we would get together and share books, share ideas, share inspirations, share space. And so one of the things that came out of that is my book that you see the cover of in the background. And the book is called Unbelonging. And again, I didn't set out to be an author or a writer, but it came to me. You know how sometimes that work finds you? Because if I were still probably teaching college level courses, I wouldn't have the bandwidth. I'd be too busy designing a syllabus right now to be able to write poetry. And so what I did was I did a lot of unlearning about how to do academic writing. And by the way, I have to share with you the OISE connection, that my very first doctoral advisor was somebody who studied at OISE. And so, you know, that way of writing, I had to unlearn in order to be able to create a book that is very much based in my life. And so here's the other thing that I have learned and continue to learn, is that many of us are disconnected from issues. So I could be disconnected from the current trauma of the First Nations community, but I can't be if I am in this mode of saying, okay, so our humanity is what connects us. And the way that I'm living my life, what is my role as a human, right? So when I ask myself those questions, I know that I have certain things that I can do, and we all have answers to that. And so one of the answers to that came up for me about 3 years ago, which was to take all of this feminist theory that I had read for a very long time, because in my doctoral work, reading bell hooks was really pivotal for me. And here's why it was pivotal. I wanted to use bell hooks as a way to frame collecting women's stories of being weeded out of the education system in a place called Botswana. And bell hooks made a lot of sense to me because she talks about teaching to transgress. She talks about from margin to center. She talks about, you know, feminism in the way that your excerpts that you read today talk about. Right, that it's what is it? What's the line that she keeps repeating? Somebody help me. Unmute yourself and please help me.
From
what is feminism?
From which, what, for everybody? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'm asking our
sorry,
any participant to read me the line about what feminism is according to bell hooks. I'm not going to be talking all by myself over here because, you know, anybody want to read me that line that keeps repeating? It's okay. Remember, there's a seed of courage today.
So are you referring from the feminism is for everybody, right?
In the preface, as well as in the very first chapter, she keeps talking about what feminism is according to her definition of feminism. And so when we get to that, if anybody feels brave enough to read that line to me that keeps getting repeated, you probably highlighted it. And so if anybody feels brave enough to read it, I'm going to tell you to read that. But what I'm going to do in the meantime, while we build up our courage, is to read you an excerpt from my book. And right now the book, it looks like this. we're type editing and we're typesetting it, and we're taking my words and making them look pretty on the page. So there's a whole process, a book design process that we're in right now. So I'm gonna read to you bell hooks. And this is in my very last section of my book. And it says, bell hooks says, the margin is more than a site of deprivation. It is also the site of radical possibility, a space of resistance, a site one stays in, clings to even, because it nourishes one's capacity to resist. It offers to one the possibility of radical perspective from which to see and create, to imagine alternatives, new worlds. And so this would just haunt me. For a very long time, it would just haunt me. And I'm like, okay, so the world that I want to live in, that I dream about living in, for all of us doesn't exist, but I could imagine it and I could write it out. I could just use words, right? We can create language, and sometimes that language can be what is that site of possibility that bell hooks talks about. And so this book was born out of that. That was one of the seeds that led to the book. And then I say to you, Kimberly Crenshaw teaches intersectionality and how identities and oppressions overlap. So then I reference Kimberly Crenshaw and the notion of intersectionality. Then I say Gloria Anzaldúa tells us, caminante, voyager, there are no bridges. One builds them as one walks. And then Audre Lorde cautions us, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. So all of these people are like right here in my head, and you might call it educational privilege, right? Like one of the poems we read. I have a lot of educational privilege, by the way, or the privileged outrage. So I have that too. And so my privileged outrage holds on to these words from people that I've read and studied and theorized and taught and put on syllabi, and then I have to do something with them. And so I wrote, in these liberatory words, I feel seen, I have a place, I imagine possibility, I practice creativity, I own the margins, I build bridges there. So I wrote it like an affirmation, right? So like those aren't just theoretical knowledge, but those are calls to action. And I wove them together as if it was a tapestry, like in Botswana where I grew up. Tapestry work and basket weaving are two things. So I like took all of those feminist theorists, bell hooks at the very core, and I wove them into a tapestry, a call to action. So that's kind of how this book is throughout. And I even have bubbles in there where I invite the reader to like research something or discuss something. And then I want to tell you about what bell hooks taught me, because I've been very privileged to meet her twice. And again, this means that we learn through relationship, that we learn through emotion, that we learn through comradeship, that we learn through friendship like Clellie and I do, right? Like we have an online virtual friendship, but now we're doing something together. And that's how we learn. I mean, that is building those, creating those possibilities, right? Because who would have imagined that I would be sharing space with you, but here we are. It's, we imagine it and then it happens. So bell hooks taught me is the next excerpt that comes out of those affirmations. I witnessed bell hooks read from her work and exude her wisdom. I was never the same. I mustered up my courage to approach her and thank her. As she signed my book with words affirming radical love, she asked me my name. The next time I saw her, read from her work, she said she remembered me by name. Now, this gift to be seen and remembered by someone as magnetic as bell hooks transformed me. Did she know I was struggling to reconcile the white feminisms of my graduate school training with my heartfelt commitment to liberating myself and folks of color just like me? She might have seen it. She might even have known it. After all, she walked and studied in the same halls and libraries where we met. On the day I met bell hooks again, I remembered myself. In those few moments, she taught me more than the learned professors and advisors who examined and interrogated my work and worth. This memory of bell hooks and her words guides me often during days when I am lost.
Oh,
Yeah, we had to take a breath there, right?
I was wondering, um, because some of the readings cross-pollinate with
Yes.
each other, and the authors and the themes, um, and everything that we have been discussing so far in this unlearning journey. It's been extraordinarily difficult to um, to do, because it is not the same thing to teach as someone that is not constantly um, under surveillance systems. It's easier for someone to teach someone that is not wearing constant categories all the times, et cetera, right? And a lot of the things that that are happening these days, or maybe I shouldn't say the last things that have been happening. What has been happening for 528 years, it's been genocide, right? And sometimes I wonder, and this is also an invitation for anybody that also wants to jump in into this, is I'm trying to imagine what it's going to be like to teach this course that it's about introduction to decolonization education. I wonder what this course is going to look like in 3 months, when people are no longer remembering the 215 children that we're crying over now. Because last week, when I found out that the 215 children had, had been discovered their bodies, it was less than 2 weeks before, in the same class, in the same space, we were talking about bones, the bones of those Black and brown children that have been used by the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton University in the name of research and in the name of teaching. Instead of returning the bodies of the remains of those children to their parents, they have been in labs. And it is also in this very same class that we are experiencing, that we experience what happened, and that we continue to experience what happens in Palestine.
Yes.
While at the same time,
Yeah.
children from Yemen are being starved. And
Yeah.
so last Friday, when I found out about the 215 children, I was simultaneously listening to a conference news, because that day was the children that had been disappeared during the Civil War. There was a massive disappearance of children in the month of May in El Salvador. And that day, I was commemorating with some colleagues in a cultural event those children that still have not been, those remains, that those children have never been found, right? And there is hundreds of more cases like that. So as someone, it's very different from someone who, and I think I'm bringing this up because of this notion of empathy and sympathy, you know? And I think that we've reached a level where it's so much bigger than us. Like even teaching this, I mean, every single day, it's like a different experience with like everyone in this particular space. And
Yeah.
my concern, and I wonder,
Yes.
like when, for example, when students that are here that are becoming educators, there are educators in the making here, there's leaders here, there's community leaders, there's elders, there is um, activists, artists, you know, when these particular students go back to their traditional colonized learning spaces, my worry now that we're coming towards the end of the course is I'm already like worrying. I haven't even finished this and I'm already like worrying ahead of time, like the impact that it's going to have on my body, the impact that it's going to have in their projects, in what they're going to do next. And that's why I invited you to ground us into courage and radical hope.
Yes. I have so many thoughts about all of that. And, you know, one of the things that I often say is that, you know, part of the decolonized way of doing things in learning spaces is being trauma informed. And those of us who are embodied the way you and I are, at any given point in time, we are going to be bleeding on some level, right? Whether our kin in Palestine are being eliminated, whether, you know, our First Nations kin are being reminded of something that they live in their bodies and encounter daily in workspaces and everywhere, or whether, you know, as you mentioned, several aspects of our awareness, whether we are physically here, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, there are parts of ourselves that are really being re-traumatized, right? So having a trauma-informed approach to this is one that does not allow us to stay in the trauma, right? Because you're able to show up to your classroom and hold a space for your students because on some level you're healing. Because we don't teach or create or be activists out of trauma, because that's not it. I always tell my people who listen to me and who I learn from that, you know, reactivism is not it. That's not education, right? That's reactivism. And reactivism will have us stop next week when we forget, when the media cycle forgets about the 215 cycles, reactivism moves on. But, you know, true activism, true learning, true liberatory education, true whatever we want to call it, it shows up day in and day out. It continues to do the work, even if you don't have a job or a paycheck that's paying you to do the work. And that's kind of how I approach it. Otherwise, I will be stifled into inaction and overwhelm. And that's not the space from which we can do any of this, right? So, you know, I'm committed to our radical healing, and I'm committed to the idea that those of us who do this work from a space of healing and radical love, the way that Bell Hooks talks about it, literally everything she writes, but she's also one who impacted me so deeply as I was reading because she exudes it. She's one of those where you're like, okay, what's on the page pales in comparison to the energy you're putting out into the world because you are that person. So we actually, you know, like what we have to do is almost infuse ourselves with these ideals and these beliefs and then continue to show up day in and out. And that's not what our society rewards, but that's really the true justice work, is to embody not the traumas, but also the healing and the radical love. And when you come out of a space of radical love, it don't matter. Today I was tired. I was really tired and really not feeling it, but it doesn't matter. Here I am. I showed up, you know, day in and day out. We show up to our students, you know, we show up to the people who depend on us. And to me, that's what I think will inform this, all of the students who've held space with you for all of these weeks, is that they'll continue to show up. That's what I know. I know that. And I think you shouldn't worry so much. Because
no, I am trying to, also, channelize some of the concerns that I've been also discussing with the students, like in private, and I wanted to run it by you, because it's something that it's kind of like in the air, somehow. It's kind of like, the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Like, I know exactly, like when somebody asks me, where do you see yourself like 3 months from now, 6 months from now, or a year from now, my answer is always dead. Like, I don't own the future.
And I laugh out of recognition, because in cultures where I come from, we laugh when somebody says something that profound, because it's real. I mean,
it's true. Yeah.
You just said something absolutely real, and I don't think it's a joke. I have to laugh in recognition of the reality and the absolute mind-blowing reality of that all of us, especially in the last 15 years, have had to grapple with that very reality, that we're not going to be alive. And so, every day I wake up, I'm like, okay, we'll make it count. We'll make it count, and how do you make it count? And again, every day I wake up, I say, make it count. But again, let me say, capitalism, racial capitalism, all of these systems that are intent on ending us, right? So genocide isn't the only way we're going to be ended. Right? Because the majority, and I say this in my book because I also have diary, like journal entries in there. And one of the things I say is that the suffering of Black and brown people, the majority of it does not make the nightly news. Okay? So these very systems are going to end us in more ways than are absolutely obvious or newsworthy. Okay, so let's be real about that. And that's why I was laughing. I was like, so real, so real, so real. And not funny, because we have to then figure out, okay, so the entire world is structured so that I don't exist. Let's be real. Okay, so for a brown child who was born on the African continent, to two disabled people who didn't have that many resources, who had so much refugee and childhood trauma from having been part of partition in Punjab, which again was settler colonial violence that partitioned a state by randomness in 1947 in much the same way as Palestine. And those very people who were so traumatized, including my own mother, who lost her mother at one, birthed and raised me. Okay, so really my life wasn't set up so that I would be the person I am. But I am evidence of the very things that we need to be focusing on, because the more we focused on all of the systems and energies that are going to end us, the more likely we are to be ended. And so what I do is, this is what I do, and I don't have any answers, but I say, make it count. Make sure that you encourage somebody every day. Make sure that you do something every day that does not involve you and is not about you. And it doesn't have to be grandiose, because again, those very systems that want to end us make us think that we have to be part of, that our life success has to be these grand gestures and these grand accomplishments. But really, honestly, even existing under conditions of genocide is commendable, is praiseworthy, is a resistance, is something to be celebrated. And that's what I'm saying is, for most of the people in this space who know what I'm talking about, our very breath is a revolution. we weren't supposed to last this long. And that's what I meant. Like, I totally got that when you said, I'll be dead. I was like, yeah, we weren't supposed to last this long.
I know I wasn't. Like, I tell my mom all the time, like, wait, I was supposed to die along like one of my cousins, but I didn't. So like, Like, if you know, well, I have a saying that says that what doesn't make you sick when you eat it, it just makes you fatter, and that's fine.
I love that expression. I would love to hear it in Spanish the way you really say it.
Yeah, like lo que no mata engorda, and that's okay. Like, it means that you're good. Like, you know, you're being taken care of in some way.
Yes. Yes. And I think this is difficult because, again, the more we doom scroll our social media, the more we're engaged in this very disconnected life that we've had,
Yeah.
the more we are to feel really daunted,
Mm.
right? Like, it is absolutely daunting to continue to inhale and exhale and to
Yeah.
exist and to take care of our assignments and to show up to class on time and meet your professor's requirements. I mean, all of those things require a lot of deep digging, and I want to acknowledge that for each of us. And yet here we are, you know, here we are. And so the more you keep telling yourself, here you are, then the more you keep going.
Yeah. And for the record, Gayatri, there's no there's no grades. Like, grades for me don't exist.
Yeah. And that's the way it should be, actually.
So, like, yeah. And because that has to do a lot with class and elitism,
Yes.
something that you touch upon and you recognize at the very beginning, and I appreciate you like disclosing that privilege that we have. On chapter 2 of
Yes.
Feminism is for Everybody, Bell Hooks talks about consciousness raising,
Yes.
right? What does that look like to you? Not, and I don't want you to, you know, go back into your like graduate years, etc., but trying to contextualize it into today. Like, what does consciousness raising mean to you based on your experience?
So consciousness isn't, you know, part of my multilingual brain is going to different words for it. And the way that we think of consciousness is very much one-dimensional, I think, in sort of Eurocentric Western notions of consciousness, right? Like, it ends up being primarily an intellectual or theoretical exercise, but that is not the way that many Eastern philosophers think of consciousness. So I just wanted to kind of reframe that the way that I think of consciousness is very much in a holistic sense, that is mind, body, and spirit. You know, that we aren't just brains or bodies, you know, that there is a part of us that really defies brain and body. I'll just leave it at that. And because of that, and whatever our ancestral or other belief systems may be, I want to honor that there's a way, that there's expansiveness, that each of us come with our own. Mine is, in this realm, is to say consciousness raising is about engaging hearts, minds, and hands, right? So again, most of the consciousness raising I do cannot be done on social media because there is very little heart that you can give, no matter how many emojis I put into my posts, no matter how many, I have the signature like golden light emoji that I use a lot, and I use the gold yellow hearts a lot. No matter how many of those I use, is still more of a sort of like you're experiencing it on this level.
Mm-hmm.
So true consciousness raising work engages the mind, heart, and hands. And by hands, I mean there is an action involved. And again, many of the young people that I know, you know, stop at sort of learning a lot. They read a lot, but has that reading really seeped into their consciousness, as in the part of them that isn't just mind and body, right? To me, consciousness resides somewhere else other than up here. And the way that you activate consciousness is through action. And again, as I just said a few minutes ago, it doesn't have to be grand actions, but it involves agency. You see, most of us can't do consciousness raising if we don't recognize that as humans, we have agency. We actually have agency. We can do stuff. I think it's Angela Davis that always reminds us that, you know, we have more power than we think we do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the notion I'm activating here, to say consciousness raising is about, at some point, recognizing that we have something to do, rather than just something to know or read about or learn. So that's kind of how I think about it, is that the critical part in activating consciousness is some form of meaningful action, purposeful action. And each of us can decide what that is. Was that too like?
No. We have silences here and we welcome them to sort of like process like what we talk about.
And there are educational scholars who talk about this. So like many, I'm really drawn, because I studied comparative education, I can say to you that the people who founded the Waldorf school movement really did kind of come up with this idea that creativity and art, for example, is the kind of action we're talking about. So let's say I read a verse, right? So like if I used to bring this into my college classroom, and I would read a verse, pause like you have, and invite reflection, and there would be silence and people would think about what we said. And then I would create space for you to go and create something based on that reflection. Now that what you create is up to you. You could make a TikTok. You could, right? Like you could make, I mean, you could make a painting. You could create a piece of music. Whatever it is, we all have those gifts. And again, I say we have more power than we think we do, because we all have creativity. And to activate and raise consciousness has to involve some element of making something, I think, even if it is just making words on a page, right? Like here's my blank page and I just scribbled on it, but it activated my consciousness. But the moment I just consume things on this level and stop there, that's not consciousness, and nothing is being raised. It stops right here. So what do we do with here? What do we do with here is always the question and invitation for all of us when you're talking about consciousness raising.
You made me think about, we've been having a lot of conversations also, especially after the class finishes. We usually, like a group of us usually stay talking and even like going more into these conversations. And one of the things that I was thinking about last night is how the urgency to run when the invitation is to crawl. Right? So then at the very beginning of the semester, what students want to know immediately when you give them a official syllabus is that they go immediately to where the deadlines are. And you know, like you've read my book, so you know that for me, lines are dead. Like deadlines signify death for me, yes. Like literally in every sense.
Yes.
And then so I'm always, I don't want to use the word fascinated. I'm thinking in Spanish. I'm always intrigued, maybe.
Yes.
When there are educators that are interested in social change and into questioning and challenging and dismantling, quote unquote, patriarchal norms, or challenging the system, whatever system it is, whatever system that is oppressing them, whatever situation that is oppressing them. And I'm always intrigued at how individuals that want to create change are in the way of creating the change itself. How? Yeah. By holding on to these deadlines, by focusing the entire experience based on grades and how they're going to be evaluated.
Yes.
Because when they have their own students, you know, whether they're children or teenagers or whatever, the reproduction of settler colonialism is infused literally in the grading system, because it is absolutely violent for me as an educator to measure everyone's awareness, or if they've done this reading, or to do a check mark, or to see who is present, who is not present during a pandemic. I mean, before I was already like that, but now I have like zero tolerance.
Yes.
Because you are expected still to produce. And Yeah, so I'm just inviting you to just like comment on that.
Yes. I think you kind of named this struggle, right? It's a struggle between what we've been taught and conditioned deeply into, that came out of colonialism, and what we're trying to create. And especially when you're still working within a system where you're expected to do the grading and evaluation, and students come in thinking that that's what they're going to get, it's very difficult. It's very uncomfortable to be in this kind of struggle that you describe. And so I have deep empathy for the students, because time and again, students would come into my classroom with that angst, right? And I honor that angst, and I know where it comes from. And what I say is, you know, we've got to figure out how to learn from that discomfort, right? Especially when the instructor is creating that space of expansiveness to say, this isn't necessarily the way we have to do education or learning, right? So Audre Lorde is the one that really I have to credit with the notion of the master's tools, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing is that grading, assessment, evaluation, pretty much everything that we do as educators is a master's tool. It is a tool for discipline. It is a tool for punishment. It is a tool for maintaining the status quo, right? So we have to realize that we're not going to do away with it, and that as much as we're trying to shift away from it, the struggle is so real to be able to say, okay, so we're still within the university and the system, and this is still a class. So by its very descriptor, we're trying to really work within something, but also shift things within it. And I think that we have to just keep trying. We have to keep making that effort. And I find that when we struggle with that, when we go to this place of creativity, then new possibilities come up, like what I was reading, right? Like earlier, is that new possibilities come up when we give ourselves permission to be creative, and that we unlearn. So unlearning is a really uncomfortable thing. And I don't know, but whiteness culture taught us that discomfort was to be avoided. And you know what? Oh, I wanted to use an F-bomb, but I'm going to restrain myself.
Oh, you are, Gayatri. Gayatri, let me pause the recording if that makes you uncomfortable.